All right, hey everyone, welcome to Facebook Live today here at Precision Camera. My name is Todd White, and I think I missed being live last week if I recall. Anyway, today we're going to talk about doing some color grading for video. Now I'm not going to go super deep on this, but I just want to spend a little bit of time. I've had some people that have asked me about this, and I teach this in my class as well. So I want to start off first of all talking about setting up and shooting for these different profiles and shooting for color grading inside of your camera. So I'm on a Lumix camera, and you guys probably know this by now. And so I'm shooting either the Lumix S1 or the S1H usually. Right now I've got my S1R in my hand, which is not primarily for video, however, just as having it here for reference. So when you are looking at video in your camera and you're going to be setting up how you're going to shoot this, the color profiles, if you will, you're going to find those usually whenever you flip your camera to video mode. Some cameras will show it to you whether you're in video or whether you're in the photo mode, but some cameras won't show you those until you flip it over into video. And you're going to look for your color profiles, and you're going to have a lot of different options. And so let's touch on just a few of those. And I'm going to be speaking the language of Lumix. There will be equivalents that you will see with various camera makers as well. So first off, we can shoot in what's called a standard profile, and that's going to be what you see is what you get. It's going to be your basic standard profile that you would see if you were shooting like photos and you were going to shoot that and maybe generate a JPEG out of that. It would just be your basic standard color profile. Then some of your cameras are going to offer what they call a flat profile. And this is not going to be flat as in like we would see with a log format, but it's going to be flat in that it's just going to be a little bit less saturated and just a little slight adjustment that you'll see with your highlights and shadows and so on, your contrast and your blacks. Still not completely desaturated, but just a little bit flatter. And then you're also going to see some that are going to have a Rec 709 type of a color profile. And some of them may say like Rec 709, some of them may call it a Rec 709L, some of just may call it a Rec 709. But a Rec 709 in the video world is your standard. That's like your standard definition type of a format for color grading. And in fact, when you shoot a log profile, which we'll talk about in a second, in order to really start grading that log profile, you'll actually want to convert it to a Rec 709. Put a Rec 709 LUT on top of it to get it close to those colors, and then you can begin grading from there. And then one of the more recent, I say new kids on the block, if you will, is going to be your HLG, your hybrid log gamma format. That is something that's going to sit in between a Rec 709 and then going fully to a log format. So you have an HLG. A lot of them are going to refer to them as an HLG 2100. And that is, like the name implies, a hybrid log gamma format that you're going to be using when you're shooting video. What this will do is that it is going to be in between your standard color profile and a log profile. It's going to offer you more dynamic range. It's going to be able to let you play with your shadows and your highlights and pull and recover more without breaking down your footage. And you'll have a little bit more of a leeway to play within the gamma space as far as the color is concerned, but it's not going to go all the way to break down like a log profile would do. And then the last one that I'll mention, but I've been alluding to, is a log format. So it's called a vlog whenever we're using the Lumix cameras. And then other cameras will have their own variation of that. And you'll just have, usually the camera maker will have their own, like F-log for Fuji, S-log for the Sony. I think C-log is what they call it for the Canon. Those are the ones I know. I don't remember what Nikon calls it. But anyway, it's a log format. And we'll take a look at some of the formats here in just a second so you get a visual of what they look like. But a log format basically flatlines, in essence, it flatlines your footage. So you'll see it, the colors are stripped out, your shadows are opened up, your highlights are dimmed down. It looks really gray, kind of like you shot everything on a cloudy day. And that's what the log profile is going to give you. So you have a lot of space to play with. It really does utilize all the dynamic range that you get within your cameras when you're shooting in a log format. Now, like I mentioned, we are not going to go crazy deep into color grading because it's a whole science into itself. But for those of us that want to shoot and edit and color our own footage, and we're like a one-man band, if you will, then it's really helpful to kind of have a baseline of starting point whenever you're going to be shooting and then going into color grade your footage. Plus, I've had a few people in my classes that have asked me and have said, hey, I went out and picked this log thing. I heard somewhere on the internet it was supposed to be great to use log, so I'm trying it, and now I have no clue what to do whenever I get back to my editing software. So we're just going to walk through some of that and give you guys some guidelines of how to work with that. Now, the other thing too to keep in mind, when you are shooting in a format that is outside of your standard formats, couple other things you have to be aware of. Number one is when you pick a format like an HLG or a log, it is going to change the base, the floor, if you will, of your ISO. So you need to be aware of that. So for example, when I choose to shoot in Vlog, all of a sudden now, the lowest my ISO will go on my camera is 640. And I believe on a log profile, I think that goes to 400. So you need to be aware of that, because if you're going to go out and you're going to try this out and you don't have your ND filters with you, then you're going to be stuck and you're going to have to crank your aperture way up to be able to compensate for that. So I highly recommend, if you're doing any video whatsoever and you're going to step outside of your standard color profile, or if you want to use video and still keep your aperture low, like at a 2.8, 1.4, even an f4 at times, then you really need to invest in your ND filters. I personally use variable ND filters, and basically these are going to be sunglasses for the camera. And so as I turn and rotate, you'll see that it gets darker and lighter. I can kind of put it over my eye here and to kind of get the feel for what this does. And this will allow you to be able to have a higher ISO outside, like when you're shooting in an HLD or in a Vlog format, and still maintain that high ISO, a low aperture, and proper exposure. Now, if you've been doing photography for a while and either videography, you've also heard of the whole ETTR, exposed to the right. And so you will be looking at doing that with video footage, especially when you're shooting in a log format. And all that basically means is you're going to expose to the right as far as on your histogram, which would be this way, I think, from your perspective. And you're going to expose to the right, and the basic what you want to do is when you're setting up your camera, put your zebras, if you can go in and set your custom zebra settings, have those sitting at about 95 to 90. And then whenever you're exposing to the right, you'll want to take your exposure up. And when you start to see your zebra showing up into the highlighted areas of your frame, then you want to pull back just a little bit and get that right just before you start to show the highlights. Now, depending upon the environment that you're shooting in and what's all around you, you'll want to obviously be able to adjust that. But that's the basic rule of thumb. If things are even, light is even across your scene, then you're going to want to go ahead and expose to the right and come off of those highlights just a little bit to where your zebras start to disappear. Obviously, when you're shooting, you will run into some scenarios where the subject, the person, you need to expose for the person, and you may have to blow things out in the background. That's just the nature of filming and a choice that you have to make, or you reset your scene to where that light's more even across your entire scene. That's a personal choice that you have to make. But main thing is watch your histogram and watch your zebras, exposing to the right, back off the highlights, because we all know if I blow it out, then that in essence goes white and I can't recover anything. Nothing is there. There's no detail there. But on the flip side of that, be careful if you let your shadows go too deep, because if you try to pull back and pull up on the shadows, you will get some discoloration and some banding and some breakdown that'll happen in the shadows whenever you're going to go in and you're going to start color grading that as well. So there's just some trade-offs there and a fine line that you have to walk through. So as I mentioned, expose to the right, and then also Use your variable ND filters and be very aware of the changes to your ISO floor that are going to happen when you're setting up your camera. All right, before I jump into Premiere here and show a couple things on the screen, are there any questions that we have coming in right now from online? Anyone with any questions? Okay, cool. One thing I want to mention really quick. A lot of different brands that are out there for using your ND filters. And like I mentioned, I use a variable ND filter. I purchased the ProMaster brand, and they have a new series out called the Prime series, which are super high quality glass. They also are fingerprint resistant and smudge resistant and so on, and they're fantastic. When you go and purchase an ND filter, I know the temptation is going to be to go a little bit less expensive on them, but I will tell you that you will regret it if you do. Pay the money. They're not going to be cheap. So go ahead and just know that for a good ND filter, a variable ND filter, like I mentioned that I use, you're going to spend $280 to $300, maybe even a little bit more depending upon the thread size of the lens that you're putting that on. But a nice little way to be able to help cushion that cost is you don't have to buy one for every single lens that you own at every single thread size. Excuse me. You can buy one that fits the largest, and then you can use step rings to get you down to your smaller lens sizes. So for me, most of the lenses that I shoot with, I'm going to have a 67, a 77, and an 82. So I can buy an 82 thread on my variable ND filter, and then I can just step ring down to the next ones. Something else to mention about these variable ND filters is that if you go with the cheaper ones, then you're going to notice a little bit of a color cast and a color shift that can happen in your footage itself, almost like you dropped a bad Instagram filter on it. I've seen some of the other brands and some of the off brands put a little bit of a purple to a gray kind of a haze and a tinge or tint, if you will, across the image. And that's not really easy to fix in post-production at all, especially if you slide into that purple range. It's a little bit easier to fix it if you end up with a little bit too warm, maybe even some magenta, because you can offset that with some green and such. But just be careful when you're purchasing your variable ND filters. Okay. Let's jump into Premiere and let's take a look at some of the different types of footage that I have set up here for us. So first off, I mentioned a standard color profile. And as you can see here, this is a standard color profile that looks pretty basic, very simple. I am going to turn off the volume so we don't get the traffic noise. But this is standard. I set this up just as your basic. This is going to be your daylight setting, but very basic type of footage that we're going to see here. All right, so that was just that. That is the standard profile. As we can see, the colors look great. I've got nice color in the clouds. I've got great colors in the trees. The courthouse here looks good. The red on my truck looks great. So that's our standard basic profile. And you can get away with shooting in that. You can. If you really want a fast, quick, down and dirty, shoot it and deliver it, you can shoot in the standard profile. Not a problem whatsoever. All right. Next one that I'm going to go over to, let me jump over here. And let's take a look at a flat profile. This is a flat color profile. A lot of cameras will have this. This is not getting into log or anything else. This is a very flat color profile. And that looks like this. Little bit of a change in the format itself. Little bit of a change, not a ton of change, but a little bit of change that we can see. And the color's a little bit flatter, and the highlights and the shadows have been adjusted some as well. And that's going to be just a flat color profile. Now, a point of reference for you guys, I am shooting everything in daylight balance because obviously I was shooting in the daylight here. So this is going to be a daylight balanced that I've done. Now, moving on to the next one, let's take a look at the Rec 709. Let's take a look at Rec 709. So as I mentioned, the Rec 709 format here, this one is going to be right now what the broadcast standard is for broadcast television is going to be a Rec 709. This is SDR footage, if you will, or SDR profile, I should say. So not a ton of change. It's a little bit of desaturation, a little bit less on the highlights and the shadows and so on, but not a crazy amount of change. But this is where we want to get our footage back to, because this is standard definition footage. Now we will take a look here at our HLG. So this is HLG. Not a huge amount of difference once again, but lots of room here to play with for highlights and shadows and even some of our color saturation that I can play with this in. HLG, like I mentioned, is a cross. It's that in-between space between shooting in your standard, which had a lot more saturation and a lot brighter, and then also shooting in Vlog. And so now we're going to take a look at Vlog footage at this time. And this is going to be your Vlog. This is going to be your toughest to actually color grade. But this is the Vlog footage that I mentioned earlier on. So as you can see with our Vlog footage, then very flat. I've got a lot of opportunity here to be able to color grade, to pull in my shadows, adjust my highlights. Got a lot of opportunity for color correction and playing with the color here. There's only one other thing that I'm going to mention that will change up how this footage works within Premiere and how easy it is to color grade or not. And the other thing I'm going to mention is the difference between shooting 8-bit and versus 10-bit. So for instance, on my cameras, I'm shooting in a 422 color space and it's 10-bit. So I've got really rich colors and really rich saturation. If you're shooting on an 8-bit camera, then your gamut, your number of colors that you can adjust and play with is going to be changed dramatically. So just know that if you're on a camera that shoots an 8-bit color, you're not going to have as much color to play with when you're doing the edit. Now, let's go ahead and take some of this footage, and we are going to pull it down into our editing timeline. Change up my sequence settings a little bit. I'm going to bring in my standard. I'm going to bring in the flat. And then I'll also bring in the Vlog footage here within the editing program. I'll mute that audio. Okay, so I've got it here set up on the timeline. And so we can begin to play with this just a little bit. And now we're going to jump over and we're going to take a look into the color section of Premiere where I have my scopes and things like that for editing. I'm going to jump over to my color tab at the top. And here we go. When you are looking at all of these scopes that are over here on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm not going to deep dive into the full technical aspect of every single one of those. And actually, when I'm working on my color scopes that are here, I will usually turn off, let me flip this over. I will usually turn off my, if I keep on getting the wrong one, sorry, here we go. I will usually look at it in this way here. And so as far as the scopes are concerned, this is called a vector scope, and this is called my waveform. So I have a vector scope, which is the circle, and the waveform, which is the one on the right. And what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for anything that starts to clip at the top or seep into the bottom. I want to try to keep my values just under the 100 and just above the 0. That's in general for terms of your exposure and also with your colors. You want to try to keep it within the boundaries so you're not pushing things outside the bounds. Over on this particular side, on my other scope over here, which is going to be my vector scope, this one is a couple of things here. The main thing on this one is I'm looking for white balance. And as you can see, the concentration, this dot right here in the middle, we want to try to keep that as close to the center as possible. That dot in the center of that is my proper white balance, if you will. And that's what I want to watch for. So if I were to come over here with my temperature slider where I have my temperature settings, and I were to start to push this either to more warm or pull it back to blue, a couple of things. You'll notice that on our waveform here, we start to see the colors pushing to the top. So we're definitely pushing colors out of bounds. And the other thing that we'll notice is over on my vector scope, notice how my concentration, the cluster, starts to move down or up, depending on which way I shift it. It's moving into the yellow space or more down into the blue space. And so once again, I'm throwing off my color balance for this particular shot. And so I want to keep that as close to the middle as possible. Now, if you look at how it spikes up over here, especially in this yellow and the red area, it's picking up different color tones in this image, but then I also have got this little bleed off that happens here in the blue and the green. Well, we can pretty much guarantee and know what's going on there. First of all, in the yellow space, I've got these buildings that are old, and so I've got some yellow stuff that's going on here. I've got green because of my tree. I've got blue because of the blue in the sky, and then I've got a little bit of red. I've got this car here. I've got part of these bricks on this building that are giving us some of that red. So I've got reasons of why I'm actually seeing some of these changes. So when we are looking at this, we can begin to make some simple adjustments, and I can pull back a little bit. I might want to go just a smidge down into the back into the blue because it was a little bit warm on that particular shot. So I can make just some basic adjustments to this footage. But once again, like I mentioned earlier, we are shooting in a standard profile. You really should not have to do a whole lot of adjustment with this particular piece of footage. If you wanted to adjust some of your exposure, you can. Just be careful. Watch as I'm making dramatic changes here and dropping my exposure down. We're seeing what's happening with my scope on the side. So here I might want to pull back maybe just to about a -2. I could come even lower if I wanted to, but I'm going to probably stay right about a -3. Right there looks pretty good. The blue's going up a little bit, but that's all that sky space that I have above me. But this looks like it's pretty balanced here, and I'm looking pretty good as far as the cluster on my scope over here as well. Now if I switch over to my next scene, this is going to be my flat color profile, and this is going to be the flat profile. And as I look at this, I've got some space to improve here. I don't have a lot of saturation that's going on, so I definitely want to adjust and make some changes here as well. So what I can do is when you're looking at your corrections over on the side, you've got a couple of options. You have your basic correction, and you also have the creative correction. I'm going to stick with us playing in this basic correction area for our time here. I will show us something that we can do with the creative side in just a little bit. But once again, in following, looking at my scopes, I look pretty good here in my scopes as far as the color balance is concerned. But really here I want to adjust mainly my saturation. So I can go in and I can begin to adjust my saturation levels. And I've got some space to play in here, and you can see as it changes my scope on the side, I've got a little bit of place to play. So I want to push that up just a little bit. We started at 100. I'm going to go just to right about 138, 135-ish. That looks like it's a comfortable space to me. I've not pushed all of my major colors up into the space at the top, so I want to be careful not to push those too far. And again, we're going to let the blue go as it is because I've got sky, I've got clouds. I'm fine with the blue being pushed into the boundaries. But we made some adjustments, and if you want to go play with some contrast here, I can definitely go pull in some more contrast. I can go a little bit more into that and see how at the bottom over here, we're actually starting to stretch ourselves into the bottom space. So now I can push that. If I go too far, it starts to cluster at the bottom, and that's way too much contrast. So I'll bring that down, and I'll set this right at about 36 to 40 range. Gives me a nice bit of contrast into my image that I'm working on here. And then you could also, and this is to taste, but you use your scopes to help guide you. I can also drop in a little bit of black into it as well, so I can push the black. See how I'm pushing that down at the very bottom? I'm going to go ahead and push those blacks just a little bit further, just right about there. So about a -1 brings a nice bit of rich blackness back into my image as far as the shadows and stuff are concerned. So I can go look at my standard image, which I have here, that we worked with a second ago, and then I can go and look at the flat profile image and see that I've got those pretty close to each other. There's a little bit of exposure change that I can do here, but as far as my color and my contrast and blacks, it looks really, really good. And I can bring up my exposure maybe just a little bit if I wanted to. That's just a personal preference point. But for our sake and what we're showing today, I've got these images looking really close to each other. Now let's go to the extreme and let's take a look at our vlog. So here is the vlog footage that I shot. And so this one has a lot of work to do. A lot of people will look at this and will get a little bit intimidated. And what I'll tell you is that your key to grading your log footage is to go out and find what we call a LUT. And you're going to be looking for what we call a log to Rec. 709 LUT. And that's going to get you back to that baseline where you can start to then go in and get you a really nice color grade. But as you look at the scopes over on the left-hand side, you'll notice this footage is very flat. I don't have any of the spikes that I had before when I'm looking at this particular scope. I don't have any of the spikes that I had before going way into the yellows and the blues and the greens and the reds. It's flat. And even here when I'm looking at all my other colors and my exposures, it is all sitting very much into the middle. And that is what log footage will do. Now, in order to get a starting point for this, I mentioned about going out and finding some LUTs. Depending upon the camera maker that you have, most of your camera makers are going to be able to provide you with LUTs that you can use to get you started. For myself, once again, since I'm shooting on the Panasonic, then I typically use what's called the VariCam LUT library. That's a different model of one of the cameras that we have for video, but the vlog that we shoot on the S series is very close to that, so they definitely work. So I go out and I find the LUT library, and I can go and download that, and it's got the different download options. And then from there, it will let me take my log format. Here it is in log. And I'll be able to get it to Rec. 709, and then I can color grade to taste from there, adjusting saturation and so on. Another place that you can go, and they've got LUTs for most all the camera makers, is Lumix LUT Pro. And this is one of your premier spots to go and pick up a LUT set to work with. Now, a couple of things on LUTs that I'm going to bring up. Let me jump really quick over here first and show you. You've got Panasonic series, you've got your Sony, your Fuji, the Blackmagic, Nikon Z, and even some of the drones are covered here as well. So these are really good LUTs that you can use to get you to a starting point that you can then begin to color grade to choice. Now, a couple quick things that I want to talk about really quick before we go any further into this conversation. Be careful about going out and spending a whole lot of money buying LUTs. Go easy on it. Don't treat this like going out and buying a bunch of presets for Lightroom or going crazy with Instagram filters and so on and so forth. Be careful with your selection and your choice. Your best bet, first of all, when you're starting out with video, shoot in the standard profile and adjust like I showed you, changing up some of your saturation, exposures, and contrasts and blacks, and level off that particular footage. Don't jump out there and start buying a bunch of LUTs, or they're also called looks for some of them as well, and go out and buy your favorite blockbuster Hollywood movie look. Be careful about doing that. Learn how to color grade, learn how to bring footage back to a standard set of colors, because depending on what you're shooting, you want to be careful, because like for myself, I shoot a lot of fashion. If I start changing the color of the garments that I'm shooting too much, then the designers that I shoot for are not going to be happy. So keep that in mind. When you start dropping in a bunch of LUTs and looks, on footage, you're going to start shifting skin tones, and reds won't be true reds and blues won't be true blues, and it gets a little muddy and messy. So I caution you with that, not to go crazy on purchasing a bunch of LUTs. Now let's jump back over and look at Premiere, and let me walk you through some basic color grading on this vlog footage that I shot. So first off, I need to go ahead and in my basic correction, I'm going to use what's called an input LUT. And I had to go out and get an input LUT for this. I'm going to go down here and pick the vlog to the Rec 709. So once I apply that, boom, look what just happened. I just went in and dropped on a basic correction LUT, and it took my vlog footage and brought it into close to Rec 709. So that is a great starting point for my color grading. From here on out, I literally could just drop that one LUT on and then begin to adjust to taste. So I've got some opportunity here for bumping up some contrasts. I'll bring my contrast in so we can see on my scope on the side. I'm pushing those values up to bring some contrast. I'm going to go ahead and deepen the blacks on this. So I'll start bringing that down. We'll notice I'm bringing the blacks in the bottom level just to where we'll start to touch that 0 down there. Looks good to me here. And my shadows look great, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. And I'll probably go ahead and bump up a little bit of my saturation. Be really careful when you're playing with saturation in an image. Typically what I tell people is before you go crazy on saturation, you may want to consider adjusting your vibrance first. Your vibrance is going to give you a nice balance of color shift across the image, whereas saturation will take the parts of the image that are already a little bit hot, if you will, your primary colors, and push those up, and usually will end up in a place that you don't want to be. So go easy on your saturation. So here, now, if I look at my images across, they're pretty good. They're really close to each other. This is back to my standard. This is back to the flat that I brought back. And this is going to be my vlog that I messed with, and I brought it back to Rec 709 and made some adjustments. Now, I will drop the exposure just a hair. It is a little bit hot, if you will. So I'll bring that exposure down some. Right at about the -1 looks pretty good. I may come in and adjust a little bit of my highlights. There we go. And so as you're seeing, I'm able to pull in and deepen those colors and deepen that footage. So that looks really good. We've got a nice cluster in the middle for white balance on this particular scope, and I'm within range on my next scope as well with the RGB as well as some exposure. So I'm looking good. Now, if you chose to do some creative LUTs, if you will, creative looks, then you can go in and you can play with some of these also. What I tend to do is I like this one called Ambition, so I'll drop that on. Notice how it changed up some of the color tones. It deepened my blacks just a little bit more and richened up some of my colors. So that came out looking really good with this one called the Ambition LUT that I've worked with before. And I'll tend to drop the intensity down. So let's talk a little bit about that. When you are using a look or you're using a particular LUT and you don't want to push it too far and change up your footage too much, you can actually adjust the intensity of it. So here, if I drop this down to 50%, you'll notice my image will change. It doesn't go as deep on the blacks in the shadows. So here I'll undo that and go back to 100%. And then I can take this back down to 50, and the changes are ever so slight of what it will do for this particular image. And I also tend to like to sharpen my footage a little bit, so I'll go ahead and sharpen it. And like I mentioned, on the vibrant side, I tend to just add just a little touch of vibrance back into my image so it looks really, really nice. Now, I'm going to show you, if you get in here and you start messing around with your looks and LUTs, I'm going to show you where that can go really bad really fast. So if I go over here to a creative LUT and I come down and I pick something, let's say Aurora, and I push this back up to the 100%. Sorry, went to 200. Got a little aggressive there. But notice how my color changed here. It's it's desaturated it some, and it's lent itself as a little bit of a gray and purple tone that comes into this play. And you might be, depending on what device you're looking at this at, you might not see all of that, but I'm looking at my screen. It definitely shifts that color a little bit. I'm going to come back out of here. We'll pick something else. That gets to be a little funky. Now this one dropped in a little bit more blue into my footage and doesn't look as clean as it did before. So you could go really bad, really fast when you start playing with some of the LUTs. Look at this particular look. This is called a fashion look. That completely messed it up big time. And even if I drop my intensity down for this, I'm not going to be able to get that fully back where I want it to go. I mean, you can see basically this is blowing out my highlights. And so this, with the fashion look, I get that. I understand what they're doing. They're going for that high key look when you're shooting fashion and stuff. So just my point here is be careful when you're going to go out and purchase a bunch of LUTs and watch what you use them for, and don't go crazy whenever you're using them. So I'll go back to the one that we had. This is the Ambition, and I'll put this right at about 75. And that looks good. So we've now taken this vlog footage that we had, and we have now shifted this to where it looks nice and looks like it's workable within the rest of our footage. I'm going to go back to my editing tab, and just to show us kind of a before and after shot that we can see, I have my footage selected. And so now when you are looking at your editing on your effects control section here in Premiere, the Lumetri color is what I've adjusted. That's where all my color adjustments are stored. So if I turn this effect off, we're back to the vlog that we had before. Turn it back on, and now there's my color corrected image. And so I can go back and forth and show the changes that I made. And like I said, it looks good. It's fairly well matched in with the rest of the footage that we have within our sequence. All right. So if there's any questions, please feel free to throw them out there. If there's anybody out has any questions online that we're looking at, we're good? Cool. If you have questions later on when you're playing with this and thinking about it, then by all means throw them into the comments below. More than happy to check back in and answer questions that you may have. The key points, though, I want to just hit these one more time to make sure we're all on the same page. When you're shooting and you're just starting out, don't frustrate yourself by going to the log just because you heard that was the thing you had to shoot video in. Shoot it in standard profile, get used to that, make some adjustments in the color section, and learn how to grade that to your taste. Then maybe dip your foot into the flat profiles, play with that a little bit, learn how to adjust, read your scopes, and bring that back. And then you may want to play with the HLG before you jump way over into the vlog. It's all a personal preference. But when you're doing any of these, just keep in mind, you need to expose properly. So be aware of your ISO floor depending upon what setting that you choose. So like I mentioned, if you're going to shoot in your basic profiles, standard, flat, vivid, landscape, and so on, those are going to let you sit at that 100 range. But if you move into the HLG, I believe that bumps you to 400. And then, of course, your log, depending on your camera maker, are going to put you in the Lumix series, will put you at 640. Other cameras, it will put you at 800 for your ISO floor. And then to help combat that and to be able to keep your aperture at the right settings or the preferred settings, then go out and get yourself some ND filters or variable ND filters, if you will. And that will help you maintain your exposure. Expose to the right or expose to the right. And turn on your zebras so you'll be able to see. Don't go blinking highlights, that'll drive you nuts. But turn on your zebras, which then will put the hash marks into the spots that are getting blown out. And then just pull back enough a little bit whenever you're using your ND filters. Just dial that back just enough to get rid of those zebras. And then you're going to be in the proper exposure range to be able then to go in and color correct and adjust your footage. So I think those are the basics. One thing real quick also is I keep mentioning an ND filter versus a variable ND filter. So the ND filters, you can buy those in just single stop increments, whereas a variable ND filter, I can spread that out and get a variety of stops. So I can go buy the single ones and get like a 1 and a 3 and a 5 and a 7 and so on. Or I can get a variable ND filter that will correct and give me 3 to 9 stops worth of correction, and that's the variable part. So Your choice on how you want to do that. I use the variable, so I just put it on and I've got a lot of range to work with versus taking it off and changing it all the time. That gets to be a little annoying. So that's my personal preference on that. All right, once again, Todd White's my name, and I am a Lumix Global Ambassador and shoot video and both photo as well. And I'm also an instructor here at Precision Camera. If you have any ideas of anything else you'd like for me to do these quick sessions on each week, by all means, send those over to the education department or drop them in the comments below if there's other topics that you'd like for us to cover, and we'll do our best to get those covered. Like I said, I mainly focus on video and then also some photo side of things as well with lighting and sound and audio and all that fun stuff. The store's open. We're here. Also at precisioncameraatx.com. So place your order online, stop in here at the store. I'd love to see you. And you guys have a great, fantastic day. And more importantly, have a wonderful, safe 4th of July weekend. See you later.